1988 was a big year for animation, and a turning point for the medium to be taken more seriously after a rough decade. But unlike theatrical animation in the 80s, which was few and far between in American theaters, TV animation was a booming industry, mostly by being part of massive media campaigns to sell toys and other licensed properties. This wasn't a possibility just before this decade, and we have Ronald Reagan to thank for it. Ronald Reagan was very pro-big business and stopping any regulation that was hindering business, which is why he put Mark S. Fowler as commissioner of the FCC. In the 70s and before, and even frankly after, there was a debate about kids' TV that children couldn't tell the difference between entertainment and actual advertising, having controversies over a 70s Hot Wheels show made by the people who made Hot Wheels, and Romp Room advertising their toys during the show. Fowler didn't question whether children had the ability to discriminate between the ads and the entertainment. He felt it was a moot point and promoted a free market, which really meant a free market of shows based on toys and licensed properties. 80s TV cartoons have a huge amount of nostalgia, and yet it was a dark time when cartoons were either based on toys or other properties. Properties would often start as toys, and the cartoons were part of a media campaign to get kids to buy them. It was a cartoons last and merch first kind of philosophy. The first cartoon to take advantage of the new FCC stuff was the Pac-Man Cartoon in 1982, and that continued and snowballed to most shows on Saturday mornings, and kid cartoon blocks were part of well-organized marketing campaigns. Not to say that all these shows are bad. I enjoyed and grew up with shows like G.I. Joe, Transformers, Gem, Masters of the Universe, Thundercats, and countless others. There's nothing really wrong with why or how these shows were made. It's just that was the majority in the 80s. Animation was playing second fiddle to a marketing campaign for toys, and that's just how it was then. This is the conclusion of 1988, the year animation broke. On April 19th, The Simpsons premiered on the third episode of The Tracy Ullman Show on the new fourth network, Fox, during its first primetime lineup. The shorts were rough and a little simple, playing almost like little quirky comic strips. The Simpsons would put the kids to bed and have a bad dream, or Bart and Lisa would fight over the TV. 4 wraparound segments would play throughout the show, going back to the drama between commercial breaks, almost like a week of comic strips. The animation was rough, and the characters were barely formed. Bart is basically the same, but everyone else almost feels like different characters. Lisa really does not feel the same at all. The Simpsons were just meant to be wraparound content during the Tracy Ullman Show, the nation's showcase for psychiatrist jokes and musical comedy numbers. After producer James L. Brooks wanted to have animated shorts go before and after the commercial breaks. Originally they were switching off with a different cartoon called Dr. and Gato, but that was canceled after the first season. But The Simpsons' more character-based comedy was also connecting with viewers more, and you can see a natural evolution throughout the various seasons. They went from being just wraparound segments in seasons 1 and 2 to their own segments outright in season 3. You can see the evolution of the show even more so than the first season of The Simpsons is often credited with. You can feel more of a vibe of a comic strip in Goodnight, but by the end of its run on The Tracy Ullman Show, it's having more fun with animation and its characters, becoming less of just kind of a simple Matt Groening comic strip to becoming something a whole lot more. The evolution of The Simpsons over this time is staggering, and only hints at what a pop culture behemoth they would eventually become. In 1988, it was only their second season on The Tracy Ullman Show, and they wouldn't get their pilot until later in 1989. But it was a beginning, and it was the beginning that would put an animation series back in prime time for the first time since the 1960s. The Simpsons would go on to show what could be done with character animation, and be maybe the most important animated show of all time. This was just the rough little start to all of it. Ducktales maybe isn't the most influential show, or even a show that represents a change. In fact, I'm probably sort of pushing it by putting it on here, but not too much, you know. The original brought a quality to TV animation that was really not going on at the time. DuckTales wasn't really a proven property in America, unlike what 80s TV animation is really known for. DuckTales' primary character was Scrooge McDuck, an older rich guy who liked to go on Indiana Jones type adventures with his nephews. In some ways, this was the perfect decade for DuckTales, as it was peak let's rip off Indiana Jones time, but it wasn't just the subject matter. The the animation was of a higher quality than audiences were used to then. Disney had tried doing TV animation earlier in the decade with the Wuzzles and Gummy Bears, but they didn't like being at the whim of one of the big three networks on Saturday mornings. It was also made to be very difficult to have the right number of episodes for syndication, where the real money's made. The Wuzzles was cancelled after 13 episodes, but the Gummy Bears did make it to that magic 65. But if they made a show directly for syndication, they could make tons of cash, especially if it were a hit. Plus, Disney has more of a global reach to sell an animated show than most studios do. It was an ambitious idea, and they didn't skimp on the animation. If it had failed, it would have been costly, but Ducktales and its adventure flick fun was a huge hit. This started Disney's syndication business, and other shows like Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers, Tailspin, and Darkwing Duck followed. A huge hit that showed that Disney could diversify in animation and also showed that you could show better and high quality animation to kids on TV and have it be successful, despite being in a limited and cynically corporate animation time. On August 2nd, 1988, Pixar premiered their third short film, Tin Toy, at the SciGraph Atlanta convention. Pixar was a new company that had spun off from the computer division of Lucasfilm and bought by Steve Jobs in 1986. It had some success with two previous short films, Luxo Jr. and Red's Dream, even garnering the first Oscar nomination for a computer animated short for Best Animated Short. But Pixar's primary business at the time was selling computers, specifically a 3D imaging computer. They weren't really that interested in making animated shorts, despite the reason the company started in the first place. However, no one believed in that more than John Lasseter, who, even though was aware the company wasn't in the best shape at the time, cutting lots of jobs right before this, he asked Steve Jobs, owner of Pixar at the time, for $300,000, and was met with a lot of skepticism, mostly because they just fired a lot of people and weren't so down to spending a lot of money right then. But after Lasseter pitched with his storyboards the same way he did at Disney, acting out every character with lots of spirit and different voices, Ralph Guggenheim, manager of the animation unit, recalled, "We knew he wasn't just pitching for the film. He was pitching for the survival of the group." Jobs gave him the $300,000, and they worked day and night, sometimes sleeping under their desks, to make Tin Toy a reality. And they actually didn't finish in time. But they did have 3/5 done, and apparently that was enough, because when Tin Toy premiered, it was met with a standing ovation from the engineers and scientists in attendance at the convention. The film, when completed, was a favorite around film festivals and became the first CGI animated film to play at most of them. It then went on to become the first CGI animated short to win Best Animated Short at the Oscars, and was the short they showed to both Disney, Tim Allen, and Tom Hanks to pitch Toy Story. Tin Toy was an important first step in getting both Pixar the company and CGI animated films taken more seriously, and getting the company's goal of making the first CGI animated feature film a reality. Ralph Bakshi's version of Mighty Mouse, or Mighty Mouse The New Adventures, might be the most influential show you probably haven't watched. I feel like most people have actually heard of this show and its controversy, but don't really actually know it. Mighty Mouse might be the first change as to what was to come to TV animation in the coming 90s up to now. Ralph Bakshi pitched this show to CBS as a last-ditch effort before giving up on the animation industry entirely, saying his car was packed. If the pitch didn't work, he was driving away and leaving the industry. He pitched a bunch of shows. None were picked up. However, as a last-ditch effort in an already last-ditch effort, Bakshi decided to pitch a new Mighty Mouse cartoon. Bakshi actually didn't have the rights to Mighty Mouse, but just sorta pitched it anyway. CBS liked the idea and wanted to actually make the show. Bakshi left in a hurry to figure out who did actually own the rights. Even CBS wasn't sure, until it turned out to actually just be them, as they had bought the rights to Terry Toons and sorta just forgot about it, which is like a thing I guess corporations just do. Bakshi had to make this show fast, as he hadn't developed it and really literally just came up with it in the room. The first season was made fast and loose, and to do it, Bakshi decided to hire kids right out of animation school. He was already working with John Kay, but then he brought in an upstart crew featuring Andrew Stanton, Bruce Timm, Jim Reardon, Jeff Pigeon, Rich Moore, Carol Holliday, Steve Gordon, Bruce Woodside, and lots of others. It's the kind of crew you couldn't get together now unless it was the most high-profile show ever, but for a time in the late 80s they were all together working on Mighty Mouse. Since they worked on it quickly and didn't really develop it, it often showed. They clearly didn't know what to do with the character of Mighty Mouse, often having episodes be more about his sidekick or a villain. The show is really more about its weird, different adaptation of Mighty Mouse than it is about Mighty Mouse himself. The show would go on to specifically influence shows like Eek the Cat and the Beetlejuice cartoon, but what it influenced more than anything was the idea of an auteur cartoon show. Ralph Bakshi was still a name at the time and had animated films actually released in theaters in somewhat recent memory. He was a named director coming to TV. Sure, Spielberg did this 2 years before with Amazing Stories, and other notable film directors had other shows they were involved with before, but Bakshi's involvement was more akin to what David Lynch would do 2 years later with Twin Peaks. It was really Ralph Bakshi's Mighty Mouse, and the press took notice. This was at a time when no one, seriously no one, who was creating cartoons was doing interviews and getting major critics and magazines to do write-ups on their premiering shows, as well as getting to be on talk shows to talk about their cartoons, but that doesn't really happen now either. Bakshi premiered the show as a new show from him. Really, Ralph Bakshi's Mighty Mouse. This wasn't the same as Hanna-Barbera or any of the other merchandise first shows of the 80s. The idea that there was a named director behind this cartoon, this would be hugely influential at what would happen in the coming decade. From John Kay and Ren and Stimpy to Craig McCracken, Gendy Tarkovsky, going all the way up to Pembleton Ward and Adventure Time. Bakshi was setting the idea of an auteur-run animated show. Sure, he didn't create the idea of Mighty Mouse, but he created that weird, odd, twisted and fun version that was being played on Saturday mornings. The first season played fine, getting critical notices and attention that most Saturday morning cartoons at the time weren't getting. It played from September to December 1987 with 13 episodes, but it wasn't until the summer of 1988 that the problem for the show started. On June 6, 1988, Donald Wildman, head of the American Family Association, claimed that the Littlest Tramp episode of Mighty Mouse had the character snorting cocaine, and is quoted saying, "CBS intentionally hired a known pornographer to do a cartoon for children, and then allowed him to insert a scene in which the cartoon hero is shown sniffing cocaine." This is mostly responding to Bakshi's previous film, Fritz the Cat, which, since it's an X-rated cartoon, I guess was considered pornography. But it should also be noted that this episode, which originally aired on October 31st, 1987, and probably aired a few times before Donald Wildman had actually seen the episode, but it actually gets worse when you watch this episode, The Littlest Tramp. The part in question goes by so quickly, you barely notice it. He's not snorting cocaine, he's smelling a crushed up flower that a character gave him earlier in the cartoon. You have to take a giant leap to even get what Donald Wildman was even talking about. Bakshi said in response, "I despise drugs. I would be out of my mind to show a cartoon character snorting cocaine in a cartoon," and decided to cut the scene from future broadcasts. Bakshi also said, "Mighty Mouse was happy after smelling the flowers because it helped him remember the little girl who sold it to him fondly. But even if you're right, their accusations became part of the air we breathe. That's why I cut the scene. I can't have children wondering if Mighty Mouse is using cocaine." Wildman found this to be a de facto admission that indeed Mighty Mouse was snorting cocaine, which is the sort of thing you'd expect from a total asshole. Mighty Mouse: The New Adventures only lasted 6 more episodes. After all the controversy, the show was effectively ruined by some jerk who sorta watched it that one time or whatever. Ralph Bakshi was considering doing more with children's animation, as that's where he got his start in animation, working on Terrytoons and the original Mighty Mouse, and he was in fact working with Nickelodeon. He was making a show called Junktown, based on an idea he had developed for a comic. Nickelodeon didn't want to do the series after the controversy, but used the pilot, which was already made, so why not, as a Christmas special, called Christmas in Tattertown, which was also the first piece of original animated content created for Nickelodeon. Ralph Bakshi did very little TV animation for kids after this, only making 2 shorts for Cartoon Network's What a Cartoon in 1995. After Mighty Mouse, he made Cool World and worked worked for both HBO and Showtime, before retiring and then sort of unretiring while also working on various film projects. Ralph Bakshi has always been an important part of animation history, an animation auteur when it was a rarity for features. He was able to promote his vision almost as predominantly as the show itself. It's as if the vision was more important than the property. A few years later, TV animation's first group of auteurs would start to emerge and continue through the following decade, up to where we are now. Bakshi's influence on TV animation may not be really as well known, but it's the idea that brought creators to the forefront. 1988 was a major year for animation. There was a lot of change, there was a lot of new voices, and there was a lot of different things going on. Clearly, animation was about to break and become what we know it today. It was an exciting year that showed a lot of promise, and that's why I wanted to make this series. I hope I've been able to show you how great of a year 1980 was for animation. I'm sorry I couldn't feature as many different voices that I either didn't know about from other countries, or ones that were my own personal favorites as a kid. I tried to pick these shows, movies, and creators that had the most lasting influence, or so I saw it. But I'm sure there are more that I couldn't feature in this series. I also regret having to talk about John Kay and John Lasseter, but they are both important parts of animation history, but I do not agree with anything that they did and do not feel personally that that should be forgotten, because that is definitely a part of their legacy and should bring you reservations about both those men, that they could get away with such things and treating people that way, and I do not agree with it in the slightest. I did not bring it up in those stories because I was just talking about the history and I did not have any information about them doing anything on those shows, so I did not speak on it. But let it be known that in the future they did do all those things, and that is truly unfortunate. 1988 was an amazing year for animation, and it was a year that's ripple effects we're seeing even to this day. I hope you enjoyed this series. I'm Jim Gisriel, and this is Deep Focus.